is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Sound Bites. I'm joined today by Jennifer Harrison as co-host. Jennifer, thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
No problem. And our guest tonight, continuing with our candidate interviews, is Tyler Joseph Ballard. I found the middle name, so I threw that in. He's an independent, and he's running for the House of Representatives from Rutland. So welcome.
Thank you for having me. I truly appreciate it. I guess first I'd like to tell the audience about myself. Really,
Yep, go right ahead.
A young 22-year-old lifelong resident of Poultney. I recently graduated from Castle University with a bachelor's in political science, and as of yesterday started my PhD studies at Brown University in American politics.
Excellent.
So I've got my hands full, but it's definitely worth the experience.
That's great. So let me just ask you, is David Wolk still, is he?
No,
Did he step down?
as of, I'm trying to think of what the year was. Was it fall of 2019, I believe?
He left?
Yeah, he retired.
Oh.
And then the new president, Karen Scalfaro, actually, she also has since left Castleton this past semester.
Because that's a great school, Castleton.
I've gotten a lot out of it, definitely. It wasn't my first choice. I didn't want to be at home.
Oh,
I wanted to be away from home.
right.
Just, that's the young adult phase, just getting out and
experiencing life
the
away
world.
from home.
Exactly.
I understand.
Money troubles, and it's a very difficult burden to take on.
That school in Champlain up in Burlington, they have just grown and just become really great schools. So, and
For
of course,
sure.
where you're going now is not too shabby
I
either.
can't complain.
Exactly.
What are your key priorities that you are discussing with your voters, and what do you hope to pursue when you're in the legislature?
Well, I believe that the key issue that we're facing in Vermont, not just in 2020, has for a while, has been tackling the very exorbitant debt that we have accrued over many years of very high deficits. And that starts really with the pensions, with our ability to fund our taxpayer-funded institutions, being able to fund the administration, being able to fund all of these other facets and capacities of our political institutions that seem to have been increasingly burdening the taxpayers. And I think that's the largest thing, is finding a way to offset our deficit, because I believe that the economy is the backbone through which other facets of society can take place. So if we can't first handle a declining economy, or declining may be an understatement, then how are we able to tackle any of the other social challenges and political challenges of contemporary society?
Right. And they seem to be growing in leaps and bounds.
That is true.
All of the social
Yes.
issues, for sure. So I'm sure you know a lot about the legislature in your political science classes. What do you think? What was the committee that would most interest you, and what would you hope to accomplish that first year? Because sometimes freshmen, they need to do something a little bit more bold to be heard.
Yes. Well, knowing the House structure, everyone's the cream of the crop for any legislator is to be in the Ways and Means Committee.
Right.
I mean, that's the key. I'm definitely not getting in that committee, but definitely key interests I have are, of course, in education and commerce and economic development.
Good for you.
And those are areas in which I believe that Vermont is struggling. I mean, fundamentally, politically, fiscally,
Right.
those are some of the key challenges. I hope to really tackle our huge economic burden that is caused by a very large education budget, a very large share of taxation going to the state education budget, because the problem becomes that we have a very high risk that we're taking on by increasing our fiscal dependency on the education institution.
Right.
But at the same time, we are not having the numbers to sustain the many institutions that we have. We're seeing a decline in student population.
Right.
And while Act 46 was, of course, supposed to consolidate
As
these
she
school
rolls her eyes.
districts, yes, consolidate these school districts and lower those costs, we've seen with recently with H 957 that now the state's backpedaling on that, and we're having to bounce back to offset the deficit that we're having by all this lost revenue that's come out of COVID-19.
Right, exactly. Commerce and Commerce and Economic Development. Sorry, I got the House name wrong. right before COVID, they passed the greatest workforce development bill I have seen. I've been involved for a whole long time, and they actually focused on tech ed. And I'm so worried that COVID, they finally got on this treadmill,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I'm just worried that COVID has sort of stopped that. And I'm hoping that when we're finally back and everything opens, that they'll take up tech ed again and make it successful, because I think that's what our businesses need.
Yeah, for sure. And we have an issue in the state of depending really, it's a tourist economy.
Right.
And when we're not facilitating means for people to grow here and create our own, we don't have homegrown industry at this
No.
point in time. It's out of state, we're bringing it in, and it's not lasting here at all. So we're not really developing our own infrastructure. We're not developing our domestic means of production. So STEM is a huge field in which,
For sure.
I mean, it's a growing field and it's going to continue to grow exponentially. Investing in that is a huge facet to be able to meet the many challenges that Vermont is facing today.
Yeah, I don't think we'll ever see an IBM here ever
No,
again.
probably
But they
not.
keep pushing on entrepreneurs, which is fabulous. But it's usually a two-person operation, and unless it's very successful and grows, that doesn't help the overall economy. But well, good for you.
In this time of seclusion, how have you been reaching out to your voters, and what is your platform?
Well, a lot of what I have done so far has been social media, but I do have more recently been getting out and trying to interact face-to-face with voters. I mean, I know it's very difficult and contentious these days to do that, but it's something I like to do. Particularly, I've been targeting many business owners because that is a huge facet, a huge proportion of our state that seems to be left behind, unfortunately, with the way some more progressive legislation has been making operating businesses more difficult. So, and I'm really invested in the slate industry, really invested in meeting with the people that operate the quarries, and that is also a huge component of not just Rutland County, not just Vermont, but in Poultney as well. And I know a lot of quarry owners, a lot of quarry workers very upset with Rep. McCoy because of her support of Act 64, which, you know, has slowly bouldered into our current 3-acre rule, the impervious soil rule. So it's very contentious, and I'm hoping to run on a platform, not necessarily of a conservative platform, because I'm sort of abandoning, not really, I guess abandoning may not be the proper word choice, but not trying to allude to a particular ideology, but more or less, how do we get individuals in a situation where they can better themselves economically, regardless of state interaction?
Great. So, can you ask? I know that the granite industry has had a lot of competition from China. Is there any similar competition for slate?
To some degree, I know some of the local quarries, they do a lot of business in China, so they are still capable of honing in on that industry.
Right.
To what extent the competition is there, I personally am not as invested.
I haven't heard it, so I just, when you mentioned that, I wonder if they're in the slate business too.
Yeah, they're able to do they're able to do quite a lot of business overseas, especially in China. And so I'm not sure if local markets there are able to sustain what Vermont or other places that really dabble in slate
Because what
have
was
to
saving
offer.
our granite industries here is while China would manufacture and design, the stone isn't near the quality of ours, and we'd wind up fixing it, patching it, and that sort of stuff. So that's how we were able to survive. But I think now things are starting to level off again, I hope. Anyway, so you were talking about revenues and stuff, and this year I think they're okay, define okay, because they had some additional monies from last year that they could fold into this year. But next year, when you're there, it's going to be a killer,
It
because
sure is.
2022, that's right, 2022, there's going to be some really hard decisions that have to be made by legislators. Have you thought about that, and where you might be willing to have a discussion about building up revenues would be great, but then also cutting expenses?
Well, I think it's the latter of the two that really needs to come first as the priority to being able to meet the challenges that we're going to have when we inevitably run an exorbitant deficit.
Right.
Taxation isn't a particularly popular or sustainable means of generating revenue in any state, regardless, especially not Vermont. So I would love to see administrative costs cut. I personally am in favor of shortening the legislative session
Oh, interesting.
and much like John Clark, as I
Yeah.
helped them a lot with doing the budgeting and a lot of the fiscal policy understanding of what that would look like, how much money that would save, and it would save a significant amount of money, close to $8 to $10 million, by not necessarily shrinking it by a huge amount, but I know some states do an alternating cycle where they'll
Yes, I was going to mention that. That
so
would be great, just every other year.
So shrinking the legislative session by a handful of weeks could have very dramatic effects. But in addition to that, I know that there has been talk of a lot of fraudulent behavior that is going on in the legislature in falsifying expense reports. And so there's the number is escaping me at this moment in time, but a certain amount of money going into, mileage reports, going into
Rooms and
room
meals
and
right,
board,
right.
Eating costs, whatever it may be, but those reports aren't necessarily being filled out honestly. To the extent to which that fraud is occurring, it may not have a very significant impact on how much money the state is spending on its on its
Right.
Centralized bureaucracy, but it delegitimizes everything that the state workers are doing, regardless of who's in the wrong and who isn't,
Right.
because it all goes back to it's corrupt, and that's not an image you want to have if you want to maintain a peaceful democracy. So, but that's a tangential argument aside. Really cutting administrative costs across all the
Right.
state mandated institutions.
Yeah. I think what has to happen with that is there's somebody working on in the state in performance is to streamline the processes. Then you can cut, because right now if you cut, the processes, I can't even say that word right, are so complicated. You really need the people to get
Yeah.
to the other end, and that's
And that's been the problem, is that it's been a fair amount of delegation on the part
Right.
of the state government, and relying far too often on these other institutions, or these other propped up organizations to do the legislating on behalf of the legislators. And whether you think that's beneficial or not, it's costing the state a lot of money.
that argument's been had before. You have to do some serious talking to the legislators. They're interesting about that when they do that stuff. So,
Very interesting. The governor has said that the economy is not coming back as quickly as hoped. What would you like to see happen?
Well, I guess first I want to sort of play with the premise of that question, more so because that almost assumes that there was an economy to return back to in the first place.
Right.
And
Good point.
I think that may be a stretch. I think
Yeah.
that regardless of the impacts of COVID-19, there have been decades of ludicrous spending that have created the problems that we're in right now, regardless of the events that take place this year, regardless of the amount of spending that the government has to do this year. It's not going to be resolved until we better understand how to be fiscally responsible at the state level. And I personally would love to see the state reinvest in the industries of agriculture and reinvest in the industries of slate, so that we have an appeal in Vermont other than, leaves and mountains. Because as you can see, when the tourism isn't able to subsidize government
Right.
behavior, government actions, this is the downfall, and it's not sustainable. So we need to find ways to invest in industries that are.
Great. Glad you brought up agriculture, thank you. Because I think we've forgotten that what we are is an agricultural economy here in state. And these guys are just struggling so hard. If it wasn't for technology, I think we wouldn't keep up the production numbers.
Exactly.
But it's so good to see people out in the farms working, and I love going to farmers market and getting fresh food and all that stuff.
Food dependency is not a problem you want to have. You want to be able to have a sustainable market for homegrown food. That is an appeal. That is a way to survive if the economy falters.
We just had a discussion with somebody here the other day. 1 in 4 Vermonters deal with food insufficiency. So when you look at a McMansion, it's not necessarily all that you pictured, because that's the first thing that people can cut without others noticing it, is the food. And 1 in 4, that's like,
That is
that's
a very
ridiculous.
significant proportion of the
Ridiculous.
population.
Anyway, you mentioned, I think, the tie-in with the expense accounts with ethics. And Campaign for Vermont has worked very hard over the years to push the state to have an ethics law. We're one of 2 states that have never had an ethics law. What do you think about all of that?
Well, ethics is a very, very contentious area that we can be able to legislate, because it hinges on the ability for the state to impose how people are supposed to behave, how they regulate their behavior. And the reality of the situation is, you can draw up all the legislation you want to regulate the way people should act, but at the end of the day, you can't really control that. So when we talk about legislature not having any foundation for ethics, that legislation may not even get off the ground, it wouldn't really matter anyway. It's about enforcement. You can't enforce moral behavior. You can't enforce on whether the individuals or institutions or state actors. You can't enforce that as much as you wish you could.
Right.
But that's just it's a statist mindset that I don't think really deals with the realities and the rational thinking that goes into why people behave the way they do.
Right. Very interesting view of that. I hadn't thought about that, because it's things like if they own stock in a company and we're passing a law that's going to directly impact that company, or if they, which some of them do work for the company you're passing a bill on, so they should raise their hand. I've always said Jim Condos currently, when he was in the legislature, was one of the few people that stood up and said, I have to recuse myself when it was something to do with his company. And not very many others
many
did
people
it.
do
No,
that, yeah.
no. That's interesting. There you go.
Well, separate from Black Lives Matter and their concerns, what are your thoughts about the protests in Montpelier and Burlington, and what would you do to bring people together and more peace?
Well, there's a double-edged sword here. I'm very much in favor. I take a very libertarian mindset when it comes to our Bill of Rights, when it comes to our U.S. Constitution, when it comes to the state constitution. I'm very much in favor of people exercising their right to assemble.
Right.
But then we have a gray area when it's used as a partisan tool, as we've seen in the way that more conservative demonstrations have been demonized, that not just by leftists, but by even the governor as early as the first demonstrations back in March and April. So I think that if we're going to understand the realities of what liberty means to be, we need to stop taking sides on the Constitution. The Constitution is non-negotiable. So I think that is an issue that we need to come together on, is that we all need to recognize our inalienable rights, that we as Americans have rights to do these things. And you don't have to necessarily agree. You don't have to love thy neighbor, you don't have to like thy neighbor, but you have to be able to understand that they have rights, and as do you. And where it becomes problematic is when we no longer are in the grounds of peaceful protests and we are becoming into the violent protests. And now when you're using your rights but infringing upon the rights of others, it's no longer constitutional. And that is something that we don't, I say we, but the mass media, mainstream media, that the state does not necessarily like to account for. I think it's going to be very difficult to bring people back together. And 2020 is going to be contentious. Every year from here on out is likely to be contentious until we stop buying into toxic and radical partisanship.
Right.
And that is a very hard sell. It's a very hard sell to say that the Democrats and the Republicans are very much 2 sides of the same coin, and both have benefited from the institutions that cause many of the social problems that we have today, whether they create the institution or whether they use it as a vehicle to fulfill whatever means they have to fulfill their ideology. They use the people, and the people need to recognize that even if they are on opposite sides, they really have the same follies. They may not be as severe for some groups as others, but they're pawns.
Yeah. We used to work together.
That's true.
We used to find the medium, the middle, very easily. It was something I was very proud of in our legislature, because you'd have a bill, and we'd always say, the best bill is the third bill. Your bill, my bill, and the compromise bill. Not anymore. You know what surprises me? Jennifer and I were at that State House fiasco, supposed to be honoring police, and a lot of the protesters showed up. You must learn in college, when you're speaking with a group, in order to get them on your side, you need to phrase your message so that that audience, whoever it is, whether it's kids or older people or ancient people like me, you have to phrase it a certain way so that they would understand and support you. The way we saw on the State House lawn was not something that I would support. I'm angry. I was frightened. That is no way to get your message across.
No, it doesn't work. People screaming at each other does not work.
And
People,
words, some of them I never heard before, like, what was that? I'm a what?
Yeah. No, so it's not solving any problems.
No.
It is not. It contributes to our radical partisanship or toxic partisanship and our very extreme movements of ideologies. Even though that, realistically speaking, we're very close in ideology, but the extremes are now so far apart that people latch onto it. It's a very much a bandwagon.
Do you think there's any possibility of just sitting down and talking to some of these folks?
I would like to believe that people are tolerant enough to be able to have difficult conversations.
Right.
But much of my faith has been diminished recently, and it's the way in which mass media portrays the other side. Well, whoever does the bidding, it doesn't matter. The way in which they portray the enemy, and when we talk, we're all Americans. I mean, here, when you present other Americans as enemies, regardless of what they believe, when they are the enemy, you will start to believe that everything they do is just unjust.
That's very true.
And that's not going to be a way for us to heal our country.
Right. Yeah, I just found it in Burlington. They made some
Very
serious demands, and the mayor called in the council to hear them. And then they went into executive session with the protesters, and I just found that I was like, whoa, because they were asking some pretty serious demands, some of which I would probably say no,
Yes.
or no way, or whatever. Anyway, it's a very sad situation. We've lost that ability to compromise and to like each other, but that's another story.
There's still hope.
There's still hope.
I really
I hope
believe
so.
that there's
Oh,
hope.
yeah.
There is.
And
Anyway,
so I was going to say, you did mention come together in the last. It's a segue. I have a Come Together International Facebook peace movement. Just thought I'd throw that in.
I love the plug.
trying to
Come Together International for peace, so people can work together. So, why do you think you are the best candidate for the position to walk into the State House?
I know I'm very young, so that's a card I have against me in politics in general, especially in this country, especially in this state. But I believe I have the expertise, the procedural expertise, and the ability to empirically diagnose many of our problems at the state and local levels and rationally create solutions, whether or not, but that's where we have an issue in many of our politicking today. Mm-hmm. We're very good at identifying problems, but not conjuring up solutions. Even if they're not necessarily the best solutions, it's coming up with a solution. But when we come up with solutions in our government, in our state government, they're very short-sighted. They don't think about the implications of the long term. And that is why I think I purposefully am the best candidate to be in the legislature at this moment in time, because I have the foresight to be able to think about the long-term implications of it, because I'm going to be around a lot longer than many people in this state. I mean, it's the second oldest state in the nation, so I'm sure I'll be around, being about half that age. So it's I don't really think about, as much as short-term gain is important, we need to think more rationally about the long-term implications when we enact policy. And I believe that I can better understand, historically speaking, because I have a very strong grasp of U.S. history, U.S. political history, and other means of legislating, that I can see the writing on the wall when we enact radical ideas, when we enact things like the 3-acre rule, when we enact things like H57, when we enact things like, or move to enact things like H610, that while it's altruistic in nature, while they may have the best intentions, the consequences of it are very great. And I believe I am better at recognizing the long-term consequences because I'm going to be around a lot longer to deal with the consequences.
How do you think, I'm
That's right.
throwing you a curve here, how do you think the political science, your political science background would help you in the State House? And about how to analyze what's going on, and how do you think that would help you?
Well, I believe I have a better grasp procedurally of what is going on in the House or whatever legislative chamber I end up
Right.
in, and now or in the future, that I have a strong grasp of how things are supposed to work. And very much the committee bypasses and many of the loopholes that go on. But I think being an empiricist, being as objective as I am, when I analyze things from a political science standpoint, I can better see a means through which the extremes can compromise, though that is unlikely to pass with the way that we are
But at least have
politicking
the
today.
discussion. That'd be good,
Exactly.
right?
I think I can better facilitate the discussion,
Yeah.
knowing that I can take a more objective route to understanding our problems.
Right, great. And what are you studying now in Brown? Just-
I'm studying American politics, but I plan on doing a minor subfield in political theory. So
Really?
two of my
This will be
two of my
your life's calling, huh?
It is,
Good for
yes.
you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's great.
That's wonderful.
That's great. Well, we really thank you for coming on. Anything else you might want to say to the audience besides
you know,
vote for me?
I mean, I could call to action, to vote for me in November, but in reality, I just want to see people participate.
Yeah.
We need more political coherence and more political participation in this country. And at the end of the day, I will be happy with a very strong turnout. I'll be happy with our ability to understand our government and its many follies.
Right.
And when we better understand what is going on in our government, when we have a higher level of political coherence, then we can see change.
I so agree with you. Even if the person I wanted didn't win, if there was an overwhelming, and I knew there were most people voted, I'd be okay with it. But the voting totals are always so low. I'm like, really, people, get out and vote.
Yeah,
You
and
know?
this year it's never been easier, so
Yeah, exactly, right at your own
might
home.
as well.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much, and we really wish you a lot of luck.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me.
No problem. Jennifer, thank you for helping out.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
It's
Thank
really
you.
fun. Yeah.
Thanks for listening in, and we'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.